They're always on. They're dynamic. And they've got a brand new way to keep you embedded within the Apple ecosystem. They're the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max. And these are the top 3 questions you asked me, Michael Fisher, ahead of today's big launch.
Question number 1. What's the deal with that always-on display?
Well, I'll tell you this, it's entirely different than what you're used to. If you're coming from an Android phone, you've probably gotten accustomed to a minimalist smattering of icons, a clock, maybe the occasional song title or calendar reminder. And if you're coming from an earlier iPhone, you're used to, well, nothing when the screen is off. This always-on display, or AOD, is neither of those. Lock the screen on your iPhone 14 Pro or Pro Max and it kind of looks like you just turned the brightness down. It's your same lock screen, complete with the new depth-detecting wallpaper and whatever widgets you want, just dimmer. If you're playing music or a podcast, you still get the album art. If you're running a persistent process like a timer, that sticks around too, minus the seconds. And of course, so do notifications. Now at the bottom of the screen, within reach of a thumb, which, as Palm taught us way back in 2009, is as the Lord intended. If that all sounds like it would drain more battery than competing always-on displays, Apple has taken steps to mitigate it. Like other phones, the iPhone will turn the AOD off if it detects that it's face down or in a pocket, and if you have an Apple Watch and walk away from the phone, it'll do the same. On top of that, automatic brightness keeps the display only as bright as it needs to be, depending on the ambient light level. When I left the phone out on my bedside table for a 7-hour sleep in a dark room, I only lost 4% overnight. That's probably because Apple has turned over control of the always-on display to a dedicated coprocessor and reduced its refresh rate to 1 Hz. Now, if you're worried that the phone will keep you up overnight, there's a dedicated sleep focus mode in iOS 16 that disables the display entirely. And if you're wondering whether the screen shifts or moves over a few pixels every few minutes to prevent burn-in over time, no, Apple says it doesn't, because its high tuning requirements for image sticking and burn-in compensation mean it doesn't need to. How that pans out, only time will tell.
Now, it does take some getting used to. The first day or so, you think you're constantly getting messages because previous iPhones would only light up the screen when you were getting a notification. But after 2 days, I'm mostly adjusted.
The only thing I would like is the option to disable the wallpaper specifically on the AOD, so the information is as glanceable as it is on the higher contrast options from some of the competition. Personally speaking, Motorola's Moto display, seen here, is still my favorite. But I get it. Apple wants to stand out from all those Android phones, so I understand the reasoning behind this initial rollout. And on the whole, I think it's a solid implementation. And if you disagree, you can always turn it off. Now, one thing that's not so easy to change is the SIM card. Because instead of a removable plastic chip, that subscriber identity module, the thing that identifies you to your wireless carrier, is now embedded within the phone. Hence, eSIM. So instead of physically swapping that chip to change phones, you now need to do it electronically if you buy an iPhone 14 built for the US market. And your questions about this have been extensive. Apple's contention is that eSIM makes the process of changing phones easier because you don't need to order a physical card in the mail or fiddle with a SIM tray. And also more secure, since a thief can't remove an eSIM from a stolen phone the way they can a physical SIM. And to Apple's credit, the process of activating the AT&T account that came with my review device was very simple. I just scanned the QR code, hit a button, and boom, service was activated. Same deal when I wanted to switch my number between iPhones later on. The entire thing took about 2.5 minutes, which I've condensed in this illustration. There's also dual SIM, dual standby, so you can run 2 eSIMs at the same time with capacity for 8 or more, depending on how important or shady you are. Now, if everyone used iPhones and every carrier in the world supported eSIM, well, I'd be all set for our new embedded-only future. But as you might expect, switching from an iPhone to an Android device involves more steps. And if you're traveling internationally, you'll want to make sure there's a provider in your destination country that supports eSIM. Apple says there are about 400 worldwide. A portion of the population that switches platforms for the weekend or regularly crosses international borders is admittedly small, and for the vast majority of iPhone buyers, this won't be a headache. But part of the reason for the big blowback you might have seen about this is that the benefits Apple says it provides aren't immediately apparent. That 2.5-minute swap I did? That would have taken less than half a minute with a physical SIM. And the old way doesn't have the same added steps and complications if you get an Android phone involved. My biggest complaint, though, is that eSIM or physical SIM doesn't have to be an either-or option. Many phones have supported both, including the iPhone itself, starting way back in 2018. It's kind of like the headphone jack all over again. Except this time, Apple isn't doing anything beneficial with the space it's reclaiming from the removed component. Unless you count millimeter wave 5G, the only other spec difference between US and international iPhones, as beneficial. One last point to round it out, eSIM does give manufacturers the chance to simplify their phone construction by eliminating the housing penetrations and additional waterproofing requirements of a SIM tray. So I think it's reasonable to expect all phones to support eSIM in short order, and hopefully, as it becomes more popular, the carriers will work to smooth out the process and, we'll all be able to change phones with the push of a button in a few years. Oh, I reached out to AT&T and Verizon, and both clarified to me that there are no limits and no charges for swapping eSIMs however many times you want.
And that's great, but at the end of the day, we're still re-involving wireless carriers in a process that for decades has been user-defined, user-controlled. And that's just not something I'm prepared to celebrate as somebody who switches phones and travels often.
And the last stop on those travels takes us to the island you've been asking me about all week. While the standard 14 packs the familiar wide notch at the top of the screen, the Pro models sport a new enclosed pill that Apple calls the Dynamic Island. And it's absolutely delightful. All manufacturers deal with the challenge of hiding front-facing cameras in different ways. Some do a simple hole punch, some do a bigger forehead over the screen, some hide the cameras right underneath the display. Apple has more equipment to accommodate than most because its front-facing camera isn't just a selfie shooter, it's also the Face ID system that unlocks the iPhone when you look at it. So rather than try to hide it in another notch, Apple separated that notch from the upper bezel, and then it built an entire software experience around that screen perforation. Unlock the phone, and the island expands to show you it's recognizing your face. Start a podcast or a Spotify session and toss it into the background, and it stretches again to accommodate the album art and waveform. Ask for directions in Apple Maps, or run that timer again, or start a phone call, or activate mobile hotspot, and relevant visual cues will live up on the island, so you can do other things in the foreground. You can tap it briefly to jump back into the active app, or long press it for contextual controls. The screen is OLED, so unless you're looking at it off-axis in very bright light, it blends beautifully with the black material of the island itself. You also asked if all the tapping we now have to do on the Dynamic Island means the selfie shooter gets smudgy. Good question. And surprisingly, the answer is no, at least for me, because the camera is offset from the center. Also a no, for the moment anyway, the island does not come down with the rest of the screen when you swipe for reachability, although this is due to be added in iOS 16.1. The island also slightly occludes the picture if you're watching videos shot in the 18:9 aspect ratio, such as Mr. Mobile videos. And yeah, it's really evident if you pinch to fill the screen with those videos. Now ask me if I care.
Nope.
I don't say that just to be glib. I really would care if Apple hadn't been thoughtful about this. If it had just shipped the same kind of hole punch that competitors had been churning out for years. But Apple really did think different this time around. It reinvented the notch in a fun, yes, delightful way. And this is just the start of it, because right now the only apps able to take advantage of it are first party, or a handful of third-party apps using the Now Playing and CallKit APIs. Later this year, when Apple makes the Live Activities API available to developers, that's when we'll start seeing some of the fun tools the company showed off on stage. Persistent sports scores, Lyft or Uber ETAs, stuff like that. Until under-display cameras take a quantum leap forward in quality and reliability, we'll still need to deal with notches and hole punches. And by the time those do go away, I bet iPhone users will have become so accustomed to the dynamic island that they'll demand a virtual equivalent, even after the need for it has passed. That's because Apple has made what was once an eyesore a pleasure. And that's
pretty cool.
This video is sponsored by dbrand, famous maker of skins and saver of Mr. Mobile phones from my own clumsiness and general recklessness since, well, before Mr. Mobile was a thing. dbrand sent over some of its grip cases along with the new Palettes collection by Ali Abdaal, and I agree with the tagline. It's like light mode, done right. Dbrand your device at the link in the description. This video was produced following 2 days with iPhone 14, 14 Pro, and Pro Max review samples provided by Apple. That's my first time being able to say that, which is also pretty cool. But folks, everything else is the same. As always, the manufacturer had no editorial input, copy approval rights, or even an early preview of this content. Stay tuned for more iPhone 14 coverage once I deliver that long-promised Samsung Galaxy Fold 4 review to you. Thanks for your patience on that. From Michael Fisher, thanks for watching, and stay mobile, my friends.